Kurt Russell joked, "Hit me," to Dean Martin, not knowing he was a fighter. The crew held their breath for 4 seconds, and what happened next taught a young Hollywood star the most important lesson of his career about never judging a man by his smooth exterior. It was October 18, 1967, and Stage 12 at MGM Studios in Culver City was doing what it always did on a Wednesday afternoon, which was everything simultaneously and none of it quietly. Grip trucks moving between setups, crew members walking with the purposeful stride of people who knew that time was money and money didn't wait for anyone to catch up. The smell of the soundstage was unmistakable. Fresh sawdust from newly built sets, electrical equipment that had been running since dawn, and the particular energy of a place where dreams were manufactured one take at a time. The stage had been dressed as a nightclub for Dean Martin's latest film, The Ambushers, the 4th installment in his Matt Helm spy series. The set was elaborate. Round tables with white tablecloths, a bar that gleamed under the studio lights, and enough atmosphere to convince audiences they were in the most sophisticated establishment in Monte Carlo rather than a soundstage in California. The afternoon shoot had wrapped 20 minutes ago, and the crew was breaking down the day's setup with the efficient choreography of people who had done this dance thousands of times before. Camera operators coiling cables, lighting technicians adjusting barn doors, script supervisors making final notes before heading to their cars, and the legendary Los Angeles traffic that waited for no one, not even Hollywood royalty. Director Phil Karlson sat in his canvas chair near the video monitor, reviewing the day's footage with the concentrated attention of a man who didn't consider any day finished until he had accounted for every frame they'd captured. Karlson had been directing since the 1940s and carried his experience like a well-tailored suit, visible to those who knew what to look for, but never ostentatious. He was satisfied with what he saw on the monitor, though he didn't show it. Film sets rewarded caution, and Karlson had learned long ago that celebrating too early was a luxury he couldn't afford. He was making notes about the morning's fight sequence when the stage door opened and Dean Martin walked back in. Dean had left an hour earlier to change out of his Matt Helm costume, and now he was dressed casually, dark slacks, a white shirt open at the collar, and loafers that had seen better days but still carried themselves with dignity. At 50 years old, Dean moved with the same unhurried grace that had made him famous, but there was something in his posture that most people missed, a certain readiness that had nothing to do with performance and everything to do with genuine physical confidence. What most people in Hollywood didn't know about Dean Martin was that underneath the smooth entertainer exterior lived someone who had learned to handle himself long before he'd learned to handle a microphone. Growing up in Steubenville, Ohio, Dean had boxed in amateur competitions, trained with serious fighters, and developed reflexes that 20 years of success hadn't softened. He kept this part of his background as private as he kept most things that mattered to him. Dean spotted Karlson and walked over with the easy stride of a man who was comfortable in his own skin and had been for long enough that it had become second nature. "Phil," Dean said, settling into the empty chair beside the director. "How did the fight scene look on playback?" Karlson looked up from his notebook, his expression shifting from professional concentration to something warmer. "Clean, Dean. Really clean. Your stunt coordinator did good work, but honestly, it looked like you could have handled those moves without him." Dean smiled, that characteristic expression that suggested he knew something amusing that he wasn't quite ready to share. "I might have picked up a thing or two over the years." They talked about the next day's schedule, about the San Francisco location work they'd be doing next week, and about the usual concerns that occupied directors and stars when they were making something they both cared about. The stage continued its end-of-day wind-down around them, and they spoke with the comfortable familiarity of two professionals who had found their rhythm. That's when the stage door opened again and Kurt Russell walked in. Russell was 26 years old and filled a room the way certain young men fill rooms when they're tall, confident, and have spent enough time in front of cameras to have learned how to be comfortable being looked at. He wore jeans and a casual shirt, and he moved with the loose, easy stride of someone whose life had so far confirmed at every turn that being Kurt Russell was a genuinely advantageous thing to be. He had been acting since childhood, was talented and knew it, and wore this knowledge with the particular lightness of someone who hadn't yet been tested in the way that eventually tests everyone. He was here to see Carlson about a potential project, and he'd stopped by on his way out of another meeting across the lot. Russell spotted Carlson and raised a hand, crossing toward him with the comfortable directness of someone who knew where he was going. He noticed the man sitting beside the director the way you notice furniture, peripherally, without investment. A well-dressed, middle-aged man who looked like he might be a producer or an executive, sitting very still, very relaxed. "Phil," Russell called out, his voice carrying the genuine warmth of someone who was actually glad to see the person he was greeting. They shook hands and immediately fell into the rapid shorthand of people who knew each other well enough to skip the formal pleasantries. Russell was funny in the authentic way, actually enjoying the conversation rather than performing enjoyment, and Carlson responded to it because real humor was not so common on film sets that you took it for granted when it appeared. They talked about the meeting Russell had just come from, which had produced no definitive outcome, but had left everyone with the pleasant sensation that something might happen while committing to nothing, which was the standard result of most Hollywood meetings. Then Russell looked again at the man in the chair beside Carlson, the way you look again at something you filed away too quickly the first time. He saw the same thing he'd seen before, well-dressed, middle-aged, very still, not talking, just present in a way that was different from how most people were present, the difference between occupying space and inhabiting it. "Who's this?" Russell asked with casual curiosity, the tone of someone indicating a piece of furniture he'd just noticed. Carlson's expression shifted slightly, the small, precise adjustment of a man who had heard something that required correction and was deciding how to make it. "Kurt," Carlson said, "I'd like you to meet Dean Martin." Russell processed the name with the particular confusion of someone whose expectations were being forcibly revised. He'd heard of Dean Martin, obviously. Everyone had heard of Dean Martin. The Rat Pack, the nightclub performances, the smooth singing style that had made him one of America's most popular entertainers. But the name was arriving attached to a man who didn't match the architecture the name had built in Russell's mind. He'd expected someone more theatrical, more obviously performative. What he saw was a quietly confident man in casual clothes who seemed completely uninterested in commanding attention or proving anything to anyone. "Dean Martin," Russell repeated, as if saying it again might help it make more sense. "The singer?" "Among other things," Dean replied, his voice carrying that distinctive warmth that had made millions of people feel like his personal friend. Russell looked at Dean more carefully now, measuring him the way young men automatically measure other men, running the calculations that their nervous systems perform without conscious instruction. Height, weight, age, what those measurements might imply about capability and threat level. What Russell saw was a man who was 50 years old, maybe 5'10", with the kind of build that suggested comfort rather than conditioning. Dean looked like exactly what Russell expected an entertainer to look like. Someone whose greatest physical challenge was probably choosing between the chicken or the fish at industry dinners. "You know," Russell said, the smile forming that had opened every door he'd needed opened so far, "I always figured you Rat Pack guys were all about the smooth talk and the fancy suits. Never really thought of you as the physical type." A grip working nearby stopped coiling cable and glanced over. Something in Russell's tone had registered as significant, though Russell himself seemed unaware of it. Dean's expression didn't change, but something shifted behind his eyes. A small adjustment, like a camera coming into focus. "What do you mean by physical type?" Dean asked, his voice maintaining its characteristic warmth while gaining a quality that Carlson recognized but Russell didn't. Russell laughed, the easy laugh of someone who believed he was sharing an obvious observation rather than revealing his own assumptions. "I mean, you're entertainers, singers, and actors, not exactly the kind of guys who get into fights or handle themselves in tough situations. All image, right? All performance?" The stage had gotten quieter around them, though Russell didn't seem to notice. 3 crew members had found reasons to move closer to the conversation. Dean stood up from his chair with the same unhurried movement he brought to everything, but there was something different in his posture now. A settling, a centering, that was almost imperceptible but somehow changed the entire dynamic of the space around him. "You think I'm all performance?" Dean asked. And there was something in his voice that should have warned Russell. But Russell was 26 and confident and had never learned to read the signs that older, wiser men had learned to watch for. "No offense," Russell said, the smile at full power now. "I just mean, guys like you're artists. You make people feel good, you entertain them. You're not exactly the type who'd know what to do in a real physical situation." He rolled his right shoulder forward slightly, a gesture that was half challenge and half invitation. "I mean, no disrespect, but if you tried to hit me, I don't think I'd have much to worry about." The stage went completely quiet. Carlson set his notebook down on the equipment cart beside him with a small, deliberate sound. He'd worked with Dean on 3 films now, and he'd heard rumors about Dean's background, stories that the smooth public persona was built on top of something considerably more substantial. "Kurt," Carlson said quietly, "you might want to reconsider that statement." But Russell was committed now, had painted himself into a corner with his own confidence, and saw only one way out, which was forward. "Seriously," he said to Dean, tapping his own shoulder twice with his left hand. "Hit me right here, full power, let's see what you've got." Dean looked at Russell's shoulder, then at his face, then back at the shoulder. "Are you sure about that, son?" Russell laughed again, but the laugh was working a little harder now. "Yeah, I'm sure. Come on, give me your best shot." Dean nodded once, the small acknowledgement of someone who had been given clear instructions and was preparing to follow them exactly. "All right," Dean said quietly. What happened next took less time than it takes to describe, but the crew members who witnessed it would remember it with perfect clarity for the rest of their lives. Dean Martin's right hand moved from his side to Kurt Russell's shoulder, in a motion that was neither slow nor fast, but simply precise. 25 years of boxing training compressed into a single movement that began at his feet, traveled through his legs and hips and back and shoulder and arm, and arrived at the contact point with the full transfer of force that proper technique and genuine power could deliver. Russell didn't stumble or stagger. He moved the way objects move when physics acts upon them. The impact traveled through his frame like a shockwave, and suddenly he was against the stage wall, not because he had stepped backward, but because the wall had simply arrived to meet him. He was standing, his legs had held, but his right shoulder was carrying something his left shoulder wasn't carrying. A specific new weight that had nothing to do with actual weight, and his expression was the expression of someone whose most recent certainty had just been removed by the most direct means available. The stage held 4 full seconds of complete silence, 4 actual seconds in which the only sound was the hum of overhead lights and the distant noise of the lot outside. Carlson broke it with a quiet exhale through his nose, the compressed sound of a man who had been waiting to see something specific and had just watched it arrive exactly as he'd expected. Russell was looking at his shoulder, then at Dean, then at his shoulder again. The smile that had been running continuously since he'd walked through the stage door had stopped completely, replaced by something quieter and more useful. The expression of someone who had been wrong about something significant and was honest enough to acknowledge it. Dean Martin was standing exactly where he'd been standing when he'd thrown the punch. Right hand back at his side, expression unchanged, the same calm and the same complete absence of anything that needed to be performed. "Son," Dean said in the same warm tone he'd been using since Russell had arrived, "next time you want to know what someone's made of, maybe ask a few questions before you make assumptions. It costs less than learning the hard way." Russell pushed off from the wall and straightened his collar, making the small physical adjustments that restore the appearance of composure while the internal accounting catches up with what the body already knows. "Okay," he said, one flat word that carried the weight of genuine understanding. "Point taken." Dean nodded and sat back down in his chair beside Carlson, picking up their conversation about the San Francisco location exactly where it had been interrupted. Because for Dean Martin, it hadn't really been interrupted. The punch had simply been something that needed to happen, and now it had happened, and the work was the thing that mattered. Russell said goodbye to both men, his voice carrying a new quality of respect that hadn't been there when he'd arrived. As he walked toward the stage door, his right shoulder carrying something his left shoulder didn't carry, Russell was already understanding that he'd learned something valuable. Not just about Dean Martin, but about the dangerous assumption that surface appearance tells you everything you need to know about what lies underneath. 20 years later, when Kurt Russell had become one of Hollywood's most respected actors, he would tell this story to young performers as a lesson about the difference between confidence and arrogance, and about the importance of treating everyone with respect until they give you a reason not to. Dean Martin taught me something that day that changed how I approached every room I walked into afterward, Russell would say. He taught me that the most dangerous people are often the ones who don't need to look dangerous, and that real strength doesn't announce itself. The story became part of Hollywood folklore, passed down among crew members and actors as a reminder that in a town built on image and performance, sometimes the most authentic thing about a person is what they choose not to perform. If this story of earned respect and hard-learned humility inspired you, make sure to subscribe and hit that like button. Share this with anyone who needs to remember that you should never judge someone's capabilities by their public persona. Have you ever been surprised by hidden strength in someone you underestimated? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to ring that notification bell for more incredible stories about the hidden depths of Hollywood's greatest legends.